Imagine discovering that everything you thought you knew about your family was a lie. That the person you trusted most had been hiding a secret for 30 years. Today's story will shock you, break your heart, and make you question everything you thought you knew. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because stories like this will stay with you forever. I always thought my childhood was perfect. Our house smelled of fresh laundry and cinnamon, and every morning, my mother's smile made everything feel safe. My father was quiet but steady, the kind of man who didn't say much but showed love in small ways. A hug, a pat on the back, or a warm smile across the table during dinner. I never questioned our life. Friends would often say, "Your family is so perfect," and I would beam with pride, convinced that our little world was the best it could ever be. Looking back now, I can see the cracks I never noticed. My mother had a habit of leaving for days without explanation. There were late-night phone calls I wasn't supposed to hear, hushed whispers that stopped the moment I walked into the room. I thought nothing of it. I trusted my parents completely, and my world was built around the idea that our family was whole and untouchable. That illusion shattered the day my father died. I remember standing in the living room, staring at the empty chair at the head of the table, and feeling a strange, hollow weight in my chest. Life, which had once felt predictable, suddenly felt fragile and fleeting. Friends and relatives offered condolences, but nothing could fill the emptiness I felt. The world seemed colder, lonelier, and I realized that even the people who had seemed untouchable could disappear without warning. A week after the funeral, while I was still trying to make sense of the loss, I noticed my mother moving around the house in a strange, distant way. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. There was a restlessness about her, as if a secret she had carried for decades was pressing against her chest, demanding to be spoken. I didn't know it yet, but that secret would change everything I thought I knew about my family. It started subtly. A misplaced photograph, a letter tucked into an old book, a name that didn't belong to anyone. I recognized they all hinted at something I couldn't yet name. And then, one afternoon, a strange letter arrived in the mail. It wasn't from my mother, and the handwriting was unfamiliar. I held it in my hands, staring at the words over and over, hoping my eyes were playing tricks on me. "Your mother wants you to know the truth. Please don't be angry. I am your sister." The words made no sense. I had a sister? A part of me, a whole other person, had existed for all these years without my knowledge. I felt a cold rush of confusion, disbelief, and curiosity all at once. My mind reeled, trying to piece together how this could be true. How my life, my perfect life, could have been built on a secret so massive, so impossible that it seemed unreal. That night, I confronted my mother. I could see it in her eyes before she even spoke. The fear, the shame, the knowledge that the truth could no longer be contained. Her hands shook, and she avoided looking at me, twisting her wedding ring as if it were a lifeline. Why didn't you ever tell me about her?" I asked, my voice breaking. She didn't answer immediately. A single tear slid down her cheek, and she whispered, "I wanted to protect you. I wanted to protect everyone." But protection didn't feel like an explanation. It felt like betrayal. A word that hurt more because I had loved her without question all these years. And that night, I realized that my perfect childhood, the life I thought I knew, had been only one side of a story, one half of a life my mother had hidden. The letter haunted me for days. I kept reading it over and over, trying to convince myself that it was a mistake, a cruel prank, or some kind of misunderstanding. But the words were clear. I had a sister I had never known existed. Her name was Anna, and somehow, for 30 years, my mother had hidden her from me. I didn't know if I was angry, scared, or curious first. It was like a storm of emotions crashing all at once. I couldn't stop thinking about what my life would have been like if she had been part of it all along. Would we have played together as children, shared secrets, argued over trivial things, and laughed until our stomachs hurt? And yet, she had lived her life in parallel with mine, just out of reach, completely unknown. Finally, I couldn't take the silence any longer. I picked up the phone and called the number on the letter. Her voice was soft but steady when she answered, and it startled me to hear the echo of my own accent in her words. "Hello?" she said. My heart raced as I managed a shaky, "Hi. I think we're related." The conversation was awkward at first. We stumbled over introductions, over explanations, over the years that had passed without either of us knowing the other. And yet, in between the awkward pauses and nervous laughter, there was a spark of connection I couldn't ignore. She was my sister, my blood, and even though we had never met, I could feel it in the way our voices carried the same rhythm, the same subtle patterns that made families recognizable even from miles apart. That night, I confronted my mother again. This time, it was different. The fear in her eyes was heavier, like the weight of 3 decades pressing down on her shoulders. She didn't try to hide it anymore. Slowly, carefully, she began to speak. She told me about a life I had never imagined, a life in another town, with another family, another set of responsibilities she had carried silently alongside the one I had always known. She explained that Anna and her brother were the result of a love she had before my father. Circumstances had forced her to leave that life behind, but she had never stopped caring for them. She had visited when she could, sent gifts and written letters, always keeping the two worlds separate to protect everyone involved. I listened, feeling my heart twist in ways I couldn't name. I wanted to scream, to cry, to demand answers, but mostly I wanted to understand. I wanted to make sense of a life that had been lived in halves, a mother who had loved fiercely but secretly. By the end of the night, one thing was clear. My world had changed forever. I could never go back to the innocence of believing our family was perfect. And yet, somewhere deep down, I knew that discovering Anna, meeting my sister, would be the beginning of something I didn't fully understand yet. A journey that would test my heart, my patience, and the limits of forgiveness. I knew I couldn't avoid it any longer. The thought of meeting Anna terrified me, but it also drew me in like a magnet. What would she be like? Would she hate me for having a life she never had? Would I even recognize myself in her? I had questions, so many questions, and I needed answers. The first time I saw her, my stomach twisted with nerves. She was sitting at a small cafe, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, staring out the window. When she looked up and our eyes met, it was like staring into a reflection I didn't know existed. Her eyes were the same shade of green as mine, the same kind of quiet intensity. Her smile, it was familiar in a way that made my heart ache. We sat across from each other, unsure of what to say. I kept thinking that I should have known her forever, that life had cheated us both. She spoke first, telling me stories about my mother's visits, the letters, the gifts, and the little traditions she had tried to maintain despite the distance. Every word painted a picture of a mother I thought I knew, but in truth, had only seen in pieces. The more she talked, the more I realized how complex my mother's life had been. For 30 years, she had carried a secret that could have destroyed her, a secret that could have fractured our entire world. And yet, she had somehow balanced two families, two lives, two sets of emotions, and somehow made it all work, imperfectly, painfully, but work it did. I felt a whirlwind of emotions, anger at the secrecy, confusion at the half-life we had lived, and awe at the lengths our mother had gone to in order to protect both families. I wanted to scream at her for hiding so much, but I also wanted to understand why she had done it. Anna and I spent hours talking, and with each word, the walls between us began to crumble. She told me about her childhood, about the times my mother had visited, about the little pieces of love she had managed to pass on despite the distance. I began to see my mother not as a villain, but as a human being trying to do what she thought was right in impossible circumstances. By the time we left the cafe, I realized something important. Anna wasn't just a stranger. She was my sister. She was part of my story, part of my mother's life, part of a truth I had to face. And even though it hurt to know that I had lived 3 decades unaware of her, I also felt a strange sense of relief. The secret was out, and now it was up to us to decide what to do with it. The more I learned about Anna's life, the more I understood the complexity of my mother's choices. She hadn't just kept a secret. She had lived 2 separate lives for 30 years, balancing love, guilt, and responsibility in a way that seemed almost impossible. In the other town, she had a husband and 2 children, people who relied on her in ways I had never imagined. She had loved them just as fiercely as she had loved us, yet she had hidden them from the life I had always known. I began going through old photos, letters, and keepsakes my mother had tucked away over the years. There were birthday cards signed with names I didn't recognize, pictures of a little boy holding a toy I had never seen, vacations that never matched any stories she had told us. Each discovery felt like opening a door to a life I was never meant to see, and yet I couldn't look away. I needed to understand the life my mother had lived in, parallel to ours. When I finally confronted her again, the room was heavy with emotion. She didn't try to hide anything this time. She spoke about the sacrifices she had made, the nights she cried alone, wishing she could be in 2 places at once, the moments she regretted, and the love she had carried for both families. Listening to her, I could feel her pain, but I could also feel the strength it had taken to hold everything together for so long. It was hard not to feel angry. How could she have kept such a monumental secret for so long? How could she have lived a double life while we believed we were her only children? But as she spoke, I began to see her, not as a deceiver, but as a human being caught in an impossible situation. Her secrecy wasn't about cruelty. It was about survival, about love stretched across boundaries she never should have had to cross. The truth forced me to reevaluate my memories. I remembered family trips that seemed ordinary at the time, gifts that appeared out of nowhere, and weekends spent visiting relatives. Each memory now carried a hidden meaning, and yet, through it all, my mother had never stopped loving us. Her love had simply existed in two worlds, perfectly imperfect, and carried quietly for decades. In the weeks that followed, I struggled with my emotions. I felt anger, betrayal, and confusion, but I also felt a growing sense of empathy. I started to understand the complexity of love, the sacrifices that sometimes go unseen, and the human capacity for endurance. My mother had been carrying a burden alone for 30 years, and now, slowly, the weight was beginning to shift. For weeks, I wrestled with anger. How could my mother hide something so enormous for so long? How could she keep a whole other family a secret while we grew up thinking we were her only children? The questions swirled endlessly in my mind, and the frustration felt unbearable. I wanted to scream, to cry, to demand answers. But every time I looked at her, I saw a woman worn down by decades of guilt and impossible choices. Slowly, I began to realize that forgiveness wasn't about condoning what she had done. It wasn't about pretending the past didn't hurt or denying the pain of the secret she had kept. Forgiveness, I understood, was about freeing myself from the anger that threatened to consume me. It was about recognizing her humanity, the fact that she had made the best choices she could under impossible circumstances. One evening, I sat with my mother in the quiet of the living room. She told me about the nights she cried, the moments she regretted, and the love she had carried for both families. She confessed that the guilt had been unbearable at times, that she had longed to tell us the truth, but feared the fallout. Listening to her, I could feel the depth of her suffering, and my heart softened in ways I hadn't expected. It was a slow process. Forgiveness didn't come all at once, but with each story she shared, each tear she shed, I felt a little lighter. I began to see her not as a mother who had deceived me, but as a woman who had loved fiercely, imperfectly, and at great personal cost. I realized that love doesn't always fit neatly into the boxes we imagine. Sometimes it stretches across mistakes, sacrifices, and secrets, and yet somehow it remains real. The turning point came one afternoon when I found myself looking at a photo of Anna and her brother, smiling shyly at the camera. I felt a pang of emotion I couldn't describe. Sadness, yes, but also a strange sense of pride. My mother had managed to keep both families connected in her own way, even when circumstances made it impossible. I understood in that moment that her love had never diminished. It had only been hidden. Once I began to forgive, everything shifted. I realized that knowing about Anna and her family didn't take away from my childhood or the love I had always felt from my mother. It added depth, complexity, and a fuller understanding of who she was. Slowly, I started to think about how the two halves of her life could come together, how we could bridge the worlds she had kept separate for so long. It wasn't easy at first. Introducing Anna and her brother into our lives felt awkward, almost surreal. Family dinners were tense at first, full of nervous smiles and hesitant conversation. We laughed awkwardly at small jokes, avoided some topics, and tiptoed around old wounds that had yet to heal. But each meeting, each shared story, each small gesture of connection slowly chipped away at the barriers between us. I began to see my mother in a new light. Watching her interact with Anna, I could see the love she had for both families, the way she laughed, the way she remembered details, the way she tried to make everyone feel included. It was messy and imperfect, but it was real. For the first time, I understood that her secret wasn't about betrayal. It was about a complicated love that had been stretched across decades, people, and impossible circumstances. As the weeks passed, we started to build new traditions. We celebrated birthdays together, shared holidays, and even began planning vacations where both sides of the family could meet. It was awkward at times, and there were moments of tension, but slowly, the two worlds began to feel like one. The walls my mother had built to protect us were coming down, and for the first time, I felt a sense of completeness I hadn't known was missing. Through all of this, I discovered something important. Life isn't perfect, families aren't perfect, and mothers aren't perfect, but love, even when messy and complicated, has a way of enduring. I began to understand that my mother's choices, though flawed, had come from a place of love, sacrifice, and human imperfection. And as I watched the two sides of our family start to connect, I realized that forgiveness wasn't just about letting go of the past. It was about creating a future. As the two families began to spend more time together, I realized how much I had learned about life, love, and resilience. My mother's secret had shaken me to my core, but it had also given me perspective. Families are not defined by perfection. They are defined by connection, by shared moments, by the willingness to forgive and to grow. I started noticing the little things that made Anna and her brother feel like part of my life. The way we would tease each other over silly childhood stories. The quiet support we offered when emotions ran high. The shared laughter at moments that should have been awkward, but somehow weren't. Slowly, I felt a sense of belonging that I had never imagined possible. It wasn't always easy. There were still moments of tension, memories that carried old pain, and conversations that made me question whether I had forgiven enough. But each time I chose empathy over anger, understanding over resentment, the bonds grew stronger. I realized that forgiveness wasn't a single act. It was a process, one that took patience, courage, and the willingness to accept human imperfection. Through all of this, I began to see my mother as more than just the woman who had hidden a secret. I saw her as a person who had loved fiercely, made mistakes, carried guilt, and endured unimaginable pressure. I began to appreciate her sacrifices, her fears, and the complexity of the choices she had made. For the first time, I understood that love is not always simple, and that sometimes it takes courage to keep it alive across impossible circumstances. One quiet afternoon, Anna and I were looking through old photographs of our mother. We laughed at the hairstyles, the fashion choices, the frozen moments in time. And then we saw a picture of our mother holding both of our childhood photographs side by side, as if trying to hold all of her love in her hands. I felt a lump in my throat. That single image told me everything I needed to know. She had loved us both equally, even when life made it impossible to do so openly. That moment was transformative. I realized that life is full of secrets, mistakes, and hidden truths, but it is also full of redemption, connection, and the chance to rewrite the future. The secret my mother had carried for 30 years no longer felt like a betrayal. It was a reminder of her strength, her love, and her humanity. I knew the journey wasn't over. There would be more challenges, more moments of doubt, and more emotions to navigate. But I also knew something important. We were learning.